Hi everybody, welcome to the final event of this season of the Sartorial Society. We're so pleased to have you all with us this evening. My name is Lucy Whitmore, I'm one of the co-organisers of this series. I'm going to be chairing this evening's papers with my colleague Liz Tregenza. And we are also joined by our team member Liz Gurnard. Tonight our theme is self-fashioned youth, and we've got three excellent papers from Mariela Aguero, Rosie Findlay and Jo Jenkinson. Before we start, I just want to say a big thank you to the Passold Research Fund for their continued support of this series, and their support really helps us reach a larger audience, so it's much appreciated. And I'm also really excited to announce that the programme for our third season has just gone live this week. We've got 7 sessions lined up through May, June and July, and the theme is looking back, the historicisms, hauntings and heritage of dress. So there's some really, really exciting subjects and some great speakers. So you can head over to our website, it's sartorialsocietyseries.com, where you can book your places for free. So a few notes of housekeeping for this evening before we get started. Your microphones and cameras are turned off. However, if you would like to ask a question for any of our speakers at any point throughout the event, you can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, you can reach us on Twitter or our Gmail account, and we'll try and assist you as best we can. And if you want to join in the conversation on Twitter, our hashtag is Sartorial Society. So we have 2 20-minute papers and 1 10-minute paper lined up for this evening. And I will now hand over to Liz to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. So Mariela Aguero is a Costa Rican historian, textile conservator and cultural analyst. She holds an MS in textiles, fashion merchandising and design from the University of Rhode Island. Her research interests include popular culture, subcultural sartorial styles and youth movements during the 20th century. She currently works as Assistant Collections Manager at the Museum of the Central Bank of Costa Rica and collaborates as a researcher on cultural heritage and conservation projects from the Department of Physics at the University of Costa Rica. Her paper is called Post-Subcultural Groups in Costa Rica, Clothing Styles During the 1990s. Over to you, Mariela.
Well, thank you so much. Give me just 1 second to share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect. Give me just 1 second. All these technical things that we have to do now are crazy, but be right there.
Yeah, don't worry.
So, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and I guess good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone, since we are all in different time zones and countries. My name is Mariela, and as Liz mentioned, I'm gonna talk about post-cultural groups in Costa Rica during the 1990s. So first of all, what I want to say is this is just a tiny part of my master's thesis, and all the images, or most of the images that you're going to see, were provided by the subjects of the study, so they're, I guess, pretty accurate. So first of all, I want to establish where Costa Rica is, in case you don't know. Costa Rica is located in Central America and is between it's between Nicaragua and Panama, so right here. So we are tiny but mighty. And well, during the 1990s, Costa Rica experienced a growth in youth bands performing different emergent music genres. With this emergence, new social groupings rise, creating new memberships and clothing styles directly linked with music taste. So I wanted to explore how foreign and local influences merge and create new styles, and identify how these youth groups form new spaces of socialization, forms of expression and consumption, all expressed through clothing styles. So today, basically, I'm going to explain the why they dress the way they did. So when I started this project, I proposed a study of rock and reggae groups during the 1990s, but as I read and researched about the topic, and mostly after the interviews with the subjects, I realized that I could not draw a line between the different music genres because basically one group could play different sounds. So therefore, I use a post-subcultural approach developed by Andy Bennett. He proposes the study of a different and at the moment, newer concepts for the study of groups and youth's behavior. Some of the concepts are youth consumerism, blurred relationship with social class, a variety of geographical spaces, and the role of media. So based on these concepts, I performed semi-structured interviews with 10 different persons who either perform in recognized musical groups in Costa Rica or belong to the scene during the decade. So since I have so little time, I'm going to point out the main findings or results of the interviews and what the subjects told me. And I want to point out that music genres included in this study cover expressions of rock, punk, alternative, ska, Caribbean inspiration, reggae, hip hop, and sound system. So for my thesis, I identified five different trends, but I'm going to emphasize on three of them today. So first of all is music influences. Here I wanted to map out where their inspiration came from and emphasize the idea of globalization and influences and how later these influences became quote unquote tropicalized. So two type of core influences were found, their family and their contemporary music outlets in the 1990s. Let me know if I break because it tells me that my connection is unstable, so I can go back. Okay, so in regards to their family influences, parental music was a key element for some of them as it defined their identity growing up. It's important to understand that their parents' music was popular during the 1960s and 70s, and it was more political with the civil rights movement, feminism, and revolutions going on in Latin America. So when it comes to their own generational views, the biggest influences came from grunge from the United States, because grunge signified a huge change in music, and what was music before that? It lowers the tone of the aesthetics and the sounds were a little bit heavier. On the other hand, hip hop was also a huge influence for people who follow reggae bands, with bands such as Run DMC, as this highlighted their heritage in pop culture. Also, the growing thing within Latin America was a huge hit. They felt identified with music, whichever the genre was. Music, because music made entirely in Spanish, just changed the dynamics of youth. Other countries such as Argentina and Mexico had older scenes which inspired the youth in Costa Rica. So these three different scenarios merged together and created new sounds and styles. So second of all, I want to talk about the meaning of style. Here I want to explain what styles meant for them. So this point basically can be explained with two different ideas and moments of the subject's life. First of all is their school uniform, but actually it was not about the uniform. It was about what it represented to them. So the uniform was a constant reminder of following the rules, blend, cannot be individualistic, need to follow an homogeneous style. But they felt they were in a box basically and needed to rebel against it. It was about what they wanted to show with their body rather than what what they were like forced to show with their body. So this point leads me to the second one, that is rebellion. They were anxious to be in university because in university you can use your, like, I guess, civilian clothes. So they could style themselves and move away from their parents and educational institution rules. They wanted to express through clothing who they were, which music they follow, their lifestyle, and their leisure activities. It was more about the reivindication of fashion, about portraying themselves in their true form. Finally, once they graduated from high school, they were able to basically follow their influences and dress like them. Like, here's an example. In the middle, you can see the singer, and he told me that all his influences were like Zeppelin, The Cure, and Soda Stereo. So you can basically see the romanticized view of rock in him. And also, I know that you guys haven't heard it, but the music sounds a lot like Soda Stereo, so it's quite interesting. For the third point that I'm going to explain is consumption and acquisition of clothing. So the consumption and acquisition of clothing complements the meaning of style, and it is important because the stores have also a sign of rebellion and availability of the clothing. So I divided this section into three different ideas. First of all is the dependence of parents as providers for clothing. Things basically weren't happy about the fact that since parents pay for the clothes, they choose what they could wear. So it was mentioned that parents love boutiques and malls because they were clean and nice. So this clean and nice brings me to the second idea, the Americanas. Americanas were secondhand stores that opened Latin America during the 1980s. And of course, because of the name, you can guess where the clothes come from. These stores were not accepted by parents because the myth is that only people of lower social status shop there. So for youth, the Americanos had two different meanings, I'm gonna say. So basically the significance of these stores is twofold. First of all, is of course the rebellion against their parents and their economic dependence. And second, the Americanas were the only store that had American styles available at the moment, and they were cheap. So these clothes also created the freedom to experiment with DIY or do it yourself, as fashion trends did not arrive as they do nowadays, because the space between America and Costa Rica was huge in the 90s. So here's just a picture of people at a concert, basically. And finally, the other way to acquire clothing was, clothing and music, of course, was shipping. Shipping was pretty expensive, but specific style stores did not exist at the moment. So for this one, I'm just gonna use like an example and talk about the Circum-Caribbean. The Caribbean coast of Costa Rica has the most important port for imports and exports, and a significant number of persons work on ships. So for reggae styles, most clothing came from Jamaica and New York because of these relationships. These styles basically weren't available within the mainstream stores. So post-cultural groups also encounter blurred lines between socialization spaces. Full allegiance was not the norm, as individuals could have numerous interactions and can emphasize with several groups throughout the day. Hence, the concept of a scene and its aspects make it suitable for the post-subcultural groups. The scene encloses a locality within urban space and is enriched by different social, economic, and historical dynamics supported by a specific moment in time. It seems nature is pluralistic, meaning that they interconnect several groups with wide differences in the same spatial place or places. Um, Clothing styles were super important to fit into a scene. Though members consolidate their identity in their teen years during high school, it was after that stage in life where they could express it thoroughly, and uniforms prevented them from showing their taste in choosing their own style and self-identity. Finally, Americanas and shipping were the main outlet for clothing hunting. Americanas were um, a direct link to the American culture and the fashion of the moment, as well as shipping provided some authenticity that the local market basically could not provide. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mariela. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sure the audience are going to have lots of questions. So please do remember to pop your questions in the using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And we'll pitch those to Mariela at the end of the session.
Thank you.
So we'll now move on to our second speaker of the evening, Dr. Rosie Findlay. Rosie is course leader of MA Fashion Cultures and Histories at London College of Fashion. Her research primarily focuses on digital fashion media. She has published journal articles on style bloggers, Instagram influencers, and direct-to-consumer digital marketing, as well as the relationship between body, imagination, and dress. She is the author of personal style blogs, Appearances That Fascinate, and she is currently co-editing Insights on Fashion Journalism with Johannes Reponen. That's probably right. Her paper is called Fashion as Mood, Style as Atmosphere, Creative Fashion Writing in London Review of Looks. Over to you, Rosie.
Thanks, Lucy. And this work that I'm going to share is actually part of my chapter for that book. So I'm so excited to share it with you. And thank you so much for having me. I loved Mariela, I loved your paper, and I can't wait to hear what Joe has to share as well. So this is an excerpt from the chapter I'm contributing to this book. Bear with me because it's not really classic fashion journalism, but what I was really hoping to unpack with this work was the ways that in forms of writing about fashion and dress, we encounter real insights into how mood, both personal and social, fold with how we as individuals dress, and also, as we'll see in London Review of Looks, how we experience the places in which we live, particularly thinking about cities, as London Review of Looks, which I'll call LRL in the paper, really, of course, focuses on London. So I'm going to start by outlining the concept of mood and how we see it cropping up in different kinds of fashion writing before we then will explore LRL together. So a language of mood is often employed in fashion writing to explain how certain styles come to feel right in a given time. In fashion criticism, moods are often invoked to explain a designer's personal inspiration or why a collection fits the current moment, their response to a shared cultural climate, forming an atmosphere to envelop us in a given season. In her review of Kate, Spring 2021, Kathy Horan suggested that the collection, with its darkness and strong, mostly unfussy shapes, confronted all the shifting moods of this time. Whereas in a different time, season, and mood, Andre Leon Talley wrote in American Vogue for January 1990 that a storm of white is brewing in the international waters of fashion. No longer content to send riots of colour down the runway, designers were showing clothes in white. Rifat Ozbek showed 80 completely white garments feeling, and I quote, oversaturated with colour. This was the only way out. Many shared his feeling that season, indicating that these designers, including Karl Lagerfeld and Isaac Mizrahi, were collectively attuning to something beyond their own individual preference. Elizabeth Sheehan, writing about fashion in modernist fiction, explains that in French, mode also refers to mood, a linguistic common ground that suggests fashion's suitability to provide ways to feel out the construction and contingencies of the just now. In practice, designers may materialize a social mood through their work, which feels right to fashion critics, who contextualize this shift for readers and encourage them to appreciate why this collection is important right now. Fashion draws mood to the surface where it can be seen, transforming something immaterial and perceived into something that can be worn, felt in a different way, and crucially, observed. As Sheehan writes, fashion holds and produces knowledge about the present and future, which may be inexpressible in another mode. Here, I consider fashion writing that articulates the moods of fashion and dress. I use the term mood here, following Martin Heidegger and others, to convey an overall orientation to the world that causes it to come into view in a certain way. I understand mood here as circulating socially, perceptible to many, yet felt and experienced at the sight of oneself. After Heidegger, to contemplate mood is to attend to the precognitive, the ways we experience the world as beings bound up in it. To be human, then, is to be contextualized in a world. But that world is not private in any sense. We are contextualized in a culture and in history, as Charles Guignon writes. Clothing, then, often considered by scholars as a material extension of our embodied self, offers a rich site to explore the ways feeling, history, and culture entangle in our sense of self. At the same time, writing that attends to these dimensions of dressed experience helps us to see these entanglements in practice, as it weaves personal experience of dressing with the influence of the wider world, which, in an unending cycle, also impresses upon and shapes dress. The kind of fashion writing I consider here is not a distinct subgenre of fashion writing. It is best described as a kind of literary nonfiction that attends to the ways mood intersects with fashion and dress. While it's not as widespread or familiar as other forms of fashion writing, it is often found in texts that favor a poetic and idiosyncratic approach to considering fashion in time and place. The interwar period is one during which this kind of writing flourished, perhaps as part of the fashion industry's encouragement of a mood of liberation and decadence to be enjoyed by the middle-class female readers who formed the primary audience of the titles publishing this work. Whether this mood was actually experienced by these readers is another question. Rather, in this period, what we encounter in the writing of people such as Diana Vreeland, Cecil Beaton, and Virginia Woolf are mood's organizational and affective qualities, as these writers compelled readers to recognize fashion's vision of the contemporary moment and respond accordingly, in other words, to get in fashion's mood. Perhaps such writing has not widely flourished in the contemporary mainstream fashion media because it does not encourage consumption, attending instead to what is ambient, hazy, and intangible, rather than offering firm reports on what is new and desirable. Contemporary fashion writing attending to mood is primarily published online. As it weaves a writer's subjectivity with fashion, it should be read in the lineage of other media that foreground personal opinion and taste that have proliferated on Web 2.0, which facilitated the emergence, as we know, of many forms of independent writing that often centered the personal and the affective. These include style blogging, online diaries, personal essays, and digital platforms such as Refinery29, Galdem, Racked, The Cut, and Fashionista that privilege fashion writing drawing on individual experience, alongside writing which aligns more closely with other forms of fashion journalism, like trend reports or fashion criticism. That fashion blogging became such a popular alternative media in which to consider the importance of style and clothing more generally, surely cannot be separated from the rise of this development in fashion writing, nor can it be extricated from the preoccupation with the self and one's social and political identities that has flourished in the digital era. Writers of such pieces draw from their experience or observations to explore what is latent in dress, the forms of knowledge it produces and holds that are often beyond the realm of language. It does not seek to persuade the reader to buy or buy into incipient trends.
Have we got a frozen screen?
Have we lost Rosie?
I think we have.
Okay, well, we'll just give her a minute, and just in case it's just a glitch, and if not, we could perhaps jump ahead to Joe and maybe come back to Rosie when.
Let's hope it'll just click back in, and we'll be fine in just a minute.
I was so entranced.
I remember the last two words, which were incipient trends.
Yeah, perfect.
Anyway, let's hopefully Rosie will be able to get back in.
Oh no, I think we have lost her. Joe, would you mind jumping in now, and we can come back halfway through Rosie's paper after yours? Are you ready to go if we do that?
I can do that. It's
Perfect.
a shame because I was really enjoying it.
I know, I was so mesmerised. But it gives us a chance to hopefully give her the time to reboot. I'll send her a message if you want to get started to let her know what we're doing. And fingers crossed her it must be a Wi-Fi issue. Okay. Liz, do you want to introduce?
Yeah,
Joe?
I'll introduce Joe, absolutely.
Perfect, and I will message Rosie.
Just give me 2 seconds.
Sorry about that, everybody. It's the first time we've actually had this happen in 2 seasons, so it was bound to happen sometime. So here we go. So I'm just pulling back up the document again because we had a little hiccup. So our third speaker this evening is Jo Jenkinson, reader and deputy head at the Manchester Fashion Institute at Manchester Metropolitan University. Jo's research practice focuses on the relationship between youth, dress and identity, positioning fashion as a method or lens through which lived experience is articulated. With her colleague John Earnshaw, Jo instigated Portrait Youth, a participatory research project that documents identities of youth through styling and dress. She is also working on a project that explores memories of youth through the lens of music and dress. Her paper tonight is called Portrait Youth, Documenting Narratives of Youth Through Styling and Dress. Over to you, Jo.
Okay, let's try and do this sharing. Has that worked? Good. Then things are looking up. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Mariela and Rosie, wherever you are, because I was really enjoying that presentation. And Mariela, I really enjoyed yours too. We have to talk afterwards. But I was really excited when I saw the call for papers for the Human Stories of Dress series, because I started out as a designer, and in the commercial world in which I worked, dress or fashion was simply a product, a material artifact that was designed or promoted or sold to a consumer that I rarely met. But it didn't take me long for me to work out that what motivated me about dress or fashion was not the product itself, but the effect that the garment or outfit had on the wearer, or what Efrat would describe as the internal dimensions of clothes and the human stories a garment or outfit can convey or create. When I was thinking about what to present, my initial thought was that I would share the research that I'm currently writing up for my PhD thesis, in which I interviewed women about their experiences of youth through the lens of everyday dress and popular music. The image on the left is one of my participants. Listening to these stories of youth, though, made me think how wonderful it would have been to know these women back then, and how past, present and future are closely linked in our everyday experience. As Keatley and Pickering proposed, we look backwards in order to see forwards. The project I've chosen to talk about today, Portrait Youth, also positions dress as a lens through which everyday experiences can be examined and articulated. My experience interviewing participants looking back at their lives has highlighted me the value of documenting youth in the present, whether consciously through oral histories or personal diaries, for example, or perhaps less consciously through kept artifacts or visual records such as family albums. Portrait Youth is a collaborative research project that aims to document the personal and collective identities and everyday lived experience of diverse groups of young people through styling and portrait photography. The project documents first-hand narratives told through dress by the young people themselves, creating a social history of youth. It also provides a space for reflection, encouraging participants to consider their past and present experience and look towards their future. We started the project in 2017, and the image here is from our first exhibition at Manchester Central Library, where 14 large-scale portraits were displayed in the reading rooms as part of the Design Manchester Festival. The project developed from our experience working with 13 to 16-year-olds at our fashion Saturday club, where we noticed the power dress or self-styling had on the club members' developing confidence and sense of identity. We identified dress as a potential conduit to wider conversations about their lived experience and the complexities of their everyday lives, and as a method through which we could access the experience of a bigger group of young people with diverse backgrounds and viewpoints. The project started with myself, my colleague John Earnshaw, who's on the right there, and Zoe Hitchin, who took the wonderful photographs in this first series. But it's evolved into a project with collaboration at its core. To date, we've worked with 5 amazing photographers, all of whom have brought their own experiences and viewpoints to the process. We've also had opportunity to collaborate with different youth groups and projects, with galleries and festivals in the city, and with the team at the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies. In this first series, we work with the Manchester Youth Council, a forum that represents the views of young people, giving them a voice and enabling them to be involved in decision-making. Following a series of visits to the Youth Council meetings, 14 young people signed up for the project, aged between 13 and 19, with the majority of the participants between 16 and 18 years old. The project is indebted to this first group as they helped shape a participant-led workshop model that we've gone on to use with further groups, some of whom have encountered far less opportunity to make their voices heard. To date, over 50 young people in the Manchester region have taken part in the project. Working with the Youth Council, we developed our workshop model, which we call Wear Your Identity. We were inspired by Goffman's reference to identity kits, items of dress and grooming tools essential to the management of an individual's personal front. We also looked at David Gauntlet's methods that use creative activities such as the building of Lego models or drawing as a means to explore identity. Our participants were asked to fill a bag with outfits, items of dress and other artifacts that they felt reflected their identities. This identity kit was then used to create self-styled looks for a photo shoot. In advance of the workshop, the photographer Zoe shared images from Irving Penn's Small Trade series as an example of how participants might incorporate personal artifacts into their styled looks. The participants brought several changes of outfit to the workshop, but also sports equipment, books, instruments, and other keepsakes as part of their kit. The workshops took place over the course of 2 days, during which time we also audio recorded semi-structured interviews asking the participants to talk about identity, how it feels to be a young person in Manchester, and how fashion and dress play a role in their everyday lives. We also asked them to describe what they included in their identity kit and why. We were quite taken aback by the eloquence with which the participants described the relationship between the clothes they chose to wear and how they define themselves. We also noted the positive impact the styling and photo shoot had on them. The physical act of dressing and styling themselves enabled them to reflect on aspects of their personality or lifestyles through the lens of dress. The visual and verbal narratives generated by the participants highlight the complex and diverse experiences of contemporary youth, suggesting that dress not only reflects personal experiences, but also supports the development of identity. The workshops with this first group validated our methods, and through the exhibition at Central Library caught the eye of other youth groups who wanted to take part in the project. Our ambition was and is to open the project out to as many young people as possible in the Greater Manchester area, to capture diverse viewpoints and experiences and a true representation of young people. There is no selection process. We've simply worked with the groups who have come forward, and we recognise that while much has been written about youth style and subcultures, we wanted our project to represent young people as they want to be seen and listen to what was important to them. We also wanted it to be truly inclusive, reflecting the wide and diverse range of experiences in this age group. In 2018, we were asked to run a portrait youth workshop for World Autism Awareness Day with a group of autistic young people from a local school. We used the same Wear Your Identity workshop model, adapting it slightly to accommodate any individual needs, but it was important to us that these young people had exactly the same opportunity to articulate their identities through dress for the photo shoot. The images taken by the photographer Amy Gotkin were displayed at Manchester Art Gallery, where the young people also took part in a celebratory event on World Autism Awareness Day. Our next collaboration came through a Centre for Youth Studies at Manchester Met. We were asked to provide a Wear Your Identity workshop with participants from Getting Out for Good, an action research project that works with at-risk young women and girls to understand the challenges they face in their local communities and to help them make choices away from risky situations or behaviours. and the photographer for this series was Megan Powell. Shortly afterwards, we worked with the photographer Heather Glazard on a workshop with young people from the Proud Trust, a life-saving and life-enhancing organisation that helps LGBT+ young people make a positive change for themselves and their communities. In this quote, one of the coordinators from the Proud Trust describes the impact of these workshops. It was a great space to informally critique and challenge some of the ideas about who is allowed the label of fashionable and who is worthy of being photographed in this style. We live in a world filled with photos of celebrities and fashion images on billboards, magazines and online, and rarely are we allowed to believe that those people can be us. They can be everyday people. The images from this collaboration were displayed on billboards during Pride weekend in Manchester, providing a very public platform for these young people. As with all the exhibitions, the choice of location was carefully selected to be both relevant and familiar to the participants. Our most recent collaboration has been with Reclaiming the Narrative, another Manchester Youth Centre initiative that is challenging Islamophobia and empowering young British Muslims. The photographer of the series was Mariam Wahid, and we hope to share more of these images through public exhibitions soon. Each group, and indeed each individual we have worked with, has taught us a little bit more about how little we understand the experience of young people, challenging our preconceived ideas about dress and youth cultures, and exposing their views on wider contexts such as faith, gender, disability, or class, for example. Going back to our first workshop with the Manchester Youth Council, the interviews and images were analysed and key themes identified to form a conceptual model that mapped out the dress behaviours described by those participants. The model, titled Dress, Youth and Identity, or DYI, was influenced by Goffman's reference to presenting oneself as onstage or backstage, but also Joanne Eicher's extensive research on dress in the public, private and secret self, and the more recent development of Eicher's model by Kimberly Miller, who adapted it for the 18 to 25 age group. Rather than referencing the secret self or dressing for fantasy from Eicher's model, which was hard for this age group to relate to, the DYI model reflects a broader notion of the private self, to include both the more visible yet deeply personal dress behaviours that overlap with public experiences of dress, such as dressing for religious festivals, and less visible private dress behaviours, dressing to conceal aspects of identity, perhaps. 6 themes or behaviours are mapped onto the DYI model. These words and references were drawn from the 14 individual narratives and the photographic images from the initial workshops with the Manchester Youth Council, and grouped under 6 headings: concealing, reflecting, respecting, playing, displaying and conforming. These represent the range of observed and reported behaviours from the private act of concealing elements of identity through dress, through to dressing for public display, choosing dress to encourage connection with others. While the model is visually linear, it's important to note that each individual's experience mapped across the spectrum, suggesting the way that young people approach dress is both contradictory and continuously changing. The model has been published in the journal Fashion, Style and Popular Culture if anyone is interested in the details, but I'm going to share a few key insights from the Wear Your Identity workshops and what we have observed since this model was drafted, bringing together the different groups and reflecting on how young people use dress to communicate and what dress can tell us about contemporary youth. In the project, dress, specifically the act of dressing and self-styling, has provided an accessible conduit through which young people's personal narratives can be expressed and documented. We asked in our initial research question how we could use the universal language of fashion and dress to explore and articulate the hopes, concerns and vision of the region's youth networks. And while we didn't pose this question directly to the participants, the young people's oral narratives demonstrated an acute understanding of the power dress has as a communication tool or language. In Fashion as Communication, Malcolm Barnard describes how outfits or items of dress may act as bridges that enable members of a group to connect with one another. This participant told us how they were already planning how they would dress when they start at their new sixth form college, stating, "I would wear clothes that are true to me so I can find people who are similar to me." For this participant, dress is deemed a reliable mode of communication and interaction, even in the absence of verbal connection. I feel like an outfit allows you to interact with other people without actually talking. The powerful images from the Portrait Youth Autism Awareness Workshop further validate dress as an effective form of nonverbal communication. For this workshop, we didn't conduct the oral interviews to enable parity of experience for all the participants who had very different communication preferences. Without the accompanying oral narratives, we relied on the images to tell the participants' stories. The young people in this group took the opportunity to be completely on stage, enjoying the opportunity to proudly perform their identities for the camera, completely at ease in their selected outfits, whether chosen for comfort, to reflect cultural identity, or proudly displaying their favourite brands. As we worked with more groups, we started to see commonalities in the way young people were using dress to simultaneously conceal and display elements of their identity. In this example, the participant describes how dress empowers them to control how others read them or make assumptions about their gender. And I think I like clothes because a lot of people in my day-to-day life read me as female. But when I wear my stereotypical masculine clothes, it's kind of like a way for me to tell people, hey, not everything is how you presume it is. Don't just presume on this because I look a certain way. I put these clothes on as a way to tell you, think again. Young people's narratives are not absent from dress literature, but the participant-led nature of this project enables us the privilege of witnessing a wide variety of perspectives. Through the lens of dress, participants have shared personal insights into their private and public worlds and described or displayed how they navigate multiple social and cultural groups and environments. The quote below is typical of many of the young people's fluctuating and transitional experiences and identities. Coming from the background that I come from, visiting different places and different occasions to do with different cultures, you have to adapt yourself and the way you dress as a sign of respect, almost, and it's a sign of fitting in. This hybridity of experience has been one of the most notable findings, and whilst the dress, youth and identity model is linear on the page, the experiences of these young people cannot be categorised neatly into distinct behaviours or styles of dress. It became apparent that young people's attitudes to and choices of dress fluctuate and adapt to reflect an occasion, environment, or the company they find themselves in, or perhaps wish to find themselves in. Through dress, they are empowered to fit in, stand out, or retreat from a situation. The young people had opportunity to style different looks for their individual photographs that reflected the various ways they present themselves in everyday life. Many styled contrasting looks and described how this reflects the diverse situations and environments they navigate. For example, the participant who appears on the left and then in the middle of the group image, who chose to be photographed in both her favourite contemporary fashion garments and traditional African dress. The participants identified commonalities in their choice of dress, and some asked to be photographed in groups, styling themselves collectively. We were interested to see how these group looks formed, noticing that items such as traditional religious dress or specific fashion trends or branded clothing appeared to bring individuals together to display their collective identity. Many of the young people referenced the importance of family and the culture of faith that they'd been brought up with. There was no direct question relating to this in the interviews, but it came through the oral narratives when discussing ideas about identity and in their choice of dress items in their kit. For many, dress was an important way to maintain this aspect of collective and personal identity. I don't want to become too lost in the westernized culture because I think that's ripping part of my identity away. But I don't want to do that. I want to carry it on through future generations. While the visual and communicative powers of dress were important to all of the individuals to some degree, there were also many references to comfort, to feeling comfortable in a situation, but also physical comfort and how clothes feel or function on the body. And then autism is in a sensory way, like what I can and I can't feel, some textures I have aversions to. And also the fact that most of my life I had no awareness of what was appropriate for what situations, like what is dressy up and what is not. These findings confirm the value of listening to a significant and diverse group of young people and the role dress can play in exposing personal experiences that help us understand broader collective experiences of youth. Whilst young people may select garments for aesthetic or cultural value and take pleasure in experimenting with different looks and styles that help them fit in with a group or environment, for others, dressing is more complex and may present physical or emotional challenges. In the Portrait Youth Project, dressing or self-styling has proved an invaluable tool for exploring identity and experience with young people. It shone a light on the complexities of contemporary youth and the multiple narratives these young people are weaving together as they move towards their independent futures. In their own words, the young people describe dress as a language through which they communicate with others. As an inclusive and relatively accessible means of communication that is relevant to all young people, dress is well placed to provide a platform or stage for young people who are less visible in society or dress research. So to conclude, these images and oral narratives offer us a snapshot or moment in time through which we may understand the present, but they also offer an opportunity to document these narratives for the future as a kind of self-styled time capsule. We hope to archive this project eventually, and I'd like to think we might meet our participants again into the far future. In 1962, Gregory Stone told us that growing up is dressing in. And when we asked our participants how they imagined themselves in 20 to 30 years' time, some of them imagined a move to a more formal or mature style of dress. But the responses were varied, and as you can see in the few examples here, whether they expect to mature up, go wild, stay the same, or simply find contentment, I hope the participants look back fondly on these images and recognise this project as part of their personal dress history. Thank you, everyone. That's me done, but please do get in touch, and we are always looking for new opportunities for collaboration or events or just a good chat with like-minded researchers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jo. That was wonderful and such amazingly striking images. I'm looking forward to discussing them a bit more in the questions. And don't forget, if you have any questions for Jo, pop them in the Q&A at the bottom. Right, so hopefully Rosie is back with us after a technological nightmare. So I'll hand back to Dr. Rosie Findlay. Rosie, if you want to just kind of start back roughly where you were and maybe give us a 30-second just reminder of where you've got to so we can get back into your headspace.
I will. Thank you, Lucy. And I'm so sorry, everyone. My internet completely crashed. That's actually never happened to me before. So of course it happened in the middle of presenting to you.
It's never happened during this series either. So it was a first for all of us.
Thank you for all of us. Okay. Well, let me share my screen. I'll certainly give you a brief reorientation.
Thank you.
So what I was, where I think we were rudely interrupted, I was making the connection between the ways that contemporary digital cultures gave space for writing the self and also writing about fashion and dress, I guess, particularly relating to this work. So thinking about how things like personal style blogs or publishing platforms like Refinery29 that publish a lot of personal essays and reflections on fashion maybe created a space where writing about experiences of dressing and the affective dimensions of dressing kind of could flourish. And I guess I was at pains to distinguish this kind of writing from other forms of fashion journalism with which we're all more familiar, like fashion criticism, which does take up ideas of mood, but often in a way of thinking about a designer's contribution to a cultural conversation. Whereas in this work, I'm really interested in how we as individuals attune to those movements too, almost that designers might be tuning into something that we also tune into in our own ways, but that also it doesn't just occur in relationship to capital F fashion, but also, as we'll see with Anna's beautiful work, with how people dress in a city. So I was kind of explaining some of the characteristics of this form of writing. So that's where we might pick up now. So I was kind of saying that this kind of contemporary writing on fashion and mood is really interested in how clothes make us feel and the feelings from which looks arise. So it draws more from the conventions of literature as a form of writing than fashion journalism. It alludes to, it is poetic, and it employs metaphor and rich description So in this sense, writing on fashion's mood entwines consideration of personal experience with wider social and political events in a way that's not exactly personal essay and not exactly reportage on fashion. In short, it is writing that attends to how clothes, which are sometimes also fashion, place us in conversation with ourselves, with other people, and the times in which we live. So in such writing, to borrow the words of philosopher Gaston Bachelard, we see how man is half-open being, attuned to and receptive of the world, enmeshed in and influenced by it, yet always understood from the vantage point of a perceiving self that's clothed. This way of thinking the self through dress is predicated on being attuned to clothing. For Heidegger, much of the world is hidden to us until our interests cause us to pay attention. To quote him, he says, an attunement is to be awakened. Not all people are attuned to the same moods, or to extend the concept to the social. It is possible to be attuned to some shared moods and not others, or for some people to find it necessary to dress towards how they feel on a given day, whereas others do not. Riffing on Heidegger's metaphor that to be attuned is to be tuned into, scholar Sarah Ahmed writes, we can close off our bodies as well as our ears to what is not in tune. We could think of moods then as ambiguous emotional states that permeate us like weather. As Ahmed notes, a mood is thus rather like an atmosphere. It is not that we catch a feeling from another person, but that we are caught up in feelings that are not our own. The rightness of a new fashion is predicated on how well it materializes this shared feeling. For many, clothing offers a means of situating the self individually and socially, and for some, attending to the weather of fashion, how people on the street are dressing, say, offers a way of thinking about what clothing means and how it helps us navigate being in the world. The atmospheres that we carry with us, described by Heidegger as a quality of witness, makes moods become almost like companions. What we carry with us is how we are carried, language that unintentionally evokes clothing, being also that which we carry as it carries us. And I'd like to turn now to consider London Review of Looks, which is a newsletter written by London-based writer Anna Kinsella, emailed to around 1,500 subscribers on an ad hoc basis, and hosted by free newsletter service Tiny Letter. LRL does not carry advertising, and as such is independent of the commercial imperative of the mainstream fashion media. Kinsella started the newsletter whilst working as an editor at a fashion magazine, and she told me in an interview that I love observing people, and I wanted to write something that would interact with both that and a kind of a sense of place as well. And so it was kind of my way of writing about fashion without writing about fashion, writing about clothing in a way that wasn't what I thought of as fashion writing. Each issue features 4 sections. Look of the week, in which Kinsella considers a look, which is an outfit or a garment, that she has seen on an individual or on various people in London. Look forecast, a general trend report in a sentence or two, that like look of the week is emblematic of a certain period in time. And where to look and what to look at, which recommend places for people watching and things to do and see in London. LRL is a newsletter composed of glances, as strangers inspire Kinsella because their looks were just right for the time and place where their paths crossed with hers. Through evocative prose, it reveals what a feeling for clothes looks like in practice. Instinctive, a kind of attunement to a feeling that others share and also materialize in their outfits. Kinsella's writing style matches this subtle, capacious mode of communication, being thoughtful rather than declarative. LRL reflects, suggests, circulates the atmospheres its author has perceived in her city. As readers, we encounter the fresh energy a change of season can invite, the ways this shift compels a transformation of clothes, and perhaps a transformation of the self. And we witness the momentary self-reflection prompted by glimpsing someone stylishly dressed in a beautifully oversized, tawny trench coat and delicate low-heeled sandals, so casually elegant, so careful and yet undone. She is in a pool of moonlight, and I slow for a second and I think, why am I not like her? LRL reveals how the choices we make in what we wear can be sensory, intuitive, imbued with memory and association. with what momentarily presses upon us and lingers, and guided by instinct towards something that feels right. Despite the idiosyncrasy of the London locations where most of these looks were staged, readers from around the world have written to Kinsella in recognition of how LRL resonates with their experiences of their own cities. In interviews, she shared that what she finds surprising, and I quote, on a continual basis, is people who have no connection to London who read it and enjoy it and might be like, you have said things that remind me of where I live in, New Zealand or Northern Italy, places you wouldn't think of as having a lot of the same characteristics of London. She attributes this to LRL's depiction of life in a city, but it may also be due to a familiar occurrence for city dwellers, what Elizabeth Wilson identifies as the silent gaze that typifies city life, in which dress, as apprehended by inquisitive glances of passers-by, is redolent with expressive clues that let the world know what sort of person you are. The anonymity of a city may offer license for people to dress how they choose, but it also offers a dynamic visual field against which to define oneself in light of the possibilities embodied by those encountered. This too permeates as Kinsella considers how London prompts self-reflection. There's a great pleasure in moving to London and watching the way you dress change. I want to look like this now, you think, spotting some perfectly elegant woman in a lace dress, entering St. John in the railway arches. Or, I feel inspired by him, looking at a man in a crisp red jacket move through the crowd, a half bottle of wine in one pocket. At the same time, these possibilities are framed by a sense of personal preference, the faithful clothes we return to again and again that answer the question, what are you anyway? Rather than realize the self suggested by taut suede mules that languish in her closet, Kinsella describes the instinctive reaching for the familiar to live in instead, the ancient Birkenstocks, the worn denim shorts, the beloved sack-like dresses. Kinsella's writing illustrates the affordances of clothes to materialize other ways of being, even if their possibilities don't make sense on us when worn, and how clothes create an atmosphere of comfort, of recognition, or a zip of excitement of dressing into a new sense of self. Intriguingly, not only does LRL subtly refuse the mainstream fashion media's discourse of constant sartorial transformation, it shows how out of sync this depiction is with how most people live. Out of sync with what she describes as London's steadfast unglamour are the December issues of fashion magazines, imploring us to get glamorous for the festive season. Haven't they seen us? I think. We don't really do that here. The magazines are in the right season, but not the right mood. And instead, it is in the exchange of glances and impressions that new possibilities of dressing may strike as a proposition to be genuinely considered. There is a kind of attunement revealed here, what Kinsella herself identifies as a mode of how dress is perceived in a wider social sense, refracted through how living in a city imprints itself on the ways that you dress, and how this can travel through certain segments of the populace, garments and styles becoming semaphores for those who see and feel them. What these mean, why they look and feel right, depends on many factors: the season, the time of day and context in which the look is worn. In some instances, it is fueled by repetition. Consider the influence of a mid-length, straight cut, dark brown leather coat, seen on Londoners, Instagrams and Hadid. And then in Kinsella's office and at a party in Dalston, until she is obsessed by the coat. I see it every day. It always looks fantastic. In this particular letter, Kinsella models the ways that the desire for certain clothes can gradually sediment through multiple impressions until I start to think of how I'd wear one. And in others, it is a sudden encounter that prompts desire, a stranger's outfit forming a proposition to reconsider oneself. Spotty socks and a smock on a woman in an art shop, for example, moving Kinsella to daydream of how she'd dress if she were a painter. LRL shows how the individual fuses with the social, as multiple people pick up on the moods these looks circulate and dress into them, even as these moods are experienced personally. The moods of the city also permeate LRL, as the languid possibility of hot weather, or the ways cities can wear one out, shape the attitude of Kinsella's observations. This is perhaps most prominent in the newsletters sent during the coronavirus pandemic, as the tedium of sheltering in place finds expression through Kinsella's loss of interest in dress. The perceptive openness that connected her to the city and its inhabitants palpably fades. Witness her observation that clothes matter a lot less now that we're in our homes all the time, before deepening in her next letter to disinterest. There used to be a lot I could read into a Patagonia fleece. Now I glance at the man in front of me in the queue and think, oh, look, a red promotional t-shirt from a JP Morgan charity fun run, probably the only thing clean this morning. The mood of these letters is one of listlessness, wherein one longs for the wild serendipity of London, now off limits, communicated through Kinsella's apathetic descriptions, but also materialized by the clothes observed. My own horrible Levi's, the man in the queue's grey New Balances, the empty dark green Daunt's books bag in his hand for the groceries. Here, this particular newsletter reflects the uncertainty of how to dress that permeated everyday life during the pandemic, and gave rise to articles such as the essay by Irina Alexander, Sweatpants Forever, published by the New York Times before going viral. The article starts by profiling the rise of casual wear label Entire World, before devolving into an obituary of the fashion system as we know it. Alexander describes the sped up fashion production cycle as nonsensical, out of step with the seasons, and constantly chasing novelty. She quotes insiders who describe fashion as a vicious cycle and exhausting. To an industry already in crisis, and I quote, COVID-19 hit. Consumers stopped having any need for fashionable clothing. Rather, it is homebody clothes that suddenly appealed, as much for the comfort they promise as for the rejection of the non-stop churn of outre fashion that they symbolize. The listlessness Kinsella feels in a Sainsbury's queue in her part of London seems part of this wider register of feeling, the openness of the world intimated by mood here, foregrounding its inherent permeability between the public and the private. To conclude then, in writing from her personal experience, Kinsella makes available a way of understanding how clothes communicate interpersonally, even as her own experiences are tailored towards the parts of London that she frequents. While there are elements of Kinsella's feeling for clothes that reveal her own preferences and identity, the process her writing richly maps of how clothes offer us perceptual ways to locate ourselves, to materialize our sense of self in relation to others and the world around us, is a common one for people living in any number of cities and finding themselves similarly attuned. Her writing also traces how these attunements occur, moments that clarify, people seen who crystallize something we have felt or even dimly perceived, strangers whose impressions linger. And I'd like to end on that note with a final word from the newsletter. It was hot out. By 10 a.m, I'd shed my jacket at the traffic lights and waited for them to change. A girl, or a woman really, cycled past in a real look. A knee-length, knife-pleated skirt and a fine sleeveless blouse, woven brown leather flats, and a battered, monogrammed Louis Vuitton bag, worn crossbody. She had a dark fringed bob and Ray-Bans. It was very Sartorialist 2008, and I nodded and thought, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie. That was brilliant. And I think there's been some really interesting connections that have come up through those three papers. And also there's like a few themes that I feel have been really kind of touched upon, but almost kind of like not necessarily accidentally, but sort of coincidentally. They're not necessarily the kind of main themes behind what you were looking at. And one of these is actually this kind of idea, I think, around sort of fast fashion. Joe, there's a question in the chat for you, and I'll start off with this one. It says, do you think that the move away from fast fashion might have an impact on clothing as a form of self-expression in young people, and how? And the person asking the question said they were thinking about changing fashions every season and how quickly our identities maybe adapt as young people.
I think one of the things that we were sort of most surprised about actually when working with all these young people is actually that how steady almost their identities were in terms of dress, and how they weren't actually wanting to sort of rush out and buy new sort of looks every Saturday afternoon. And I think that's kind of what I expected. And I know that a lot of young people, probably at that time that we were doing those workshops, that was still very much happening. But I would love to do, we haven't actually done any iterations of the project since lockdown. I'd be interested to know how that's changed, actually. I think it's really interesting what Rosie was just talking about there, and how things have shifted with us not being living the same lives at all, I guess. But I do actually think young people's approach to dress is much more embedded in who they are and less in fashion trends than we assume. But I also thought Mariela's presentation was really interesting, and, you know, that transition between school and college, and then university, and then when you go into sort of working life. And I think that's come up through both of our work by the looks of it as a theme. And I think that sort of transition from somebody, your mum buying your clothes, to that kind of wanting to rebel against that, probably by buying all that you can afford on a Saturday afternoon in a kind of high street retailer, through to being able to be more sort of considered and really choosing how you dress and how you consume fashion. I think that's really interesting, that transition.
Mariela, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, for me it was fascinating. I guess that was the only finding that I was like, I never expected that on that sense of they sorry, let me get my thoughts right, of them just like, you know, the rebellion. For me, the rebellion aspect was just like crazy, and I can see like the parallelisms of like your photographs and your project, because they really want to like express themselves and just show themselves in their true self, or what they think is their true self, which is basically the parallelism between, I guess, what I can see from your work and my work. So I find that pretty interesting that we both touch the same topic in different like scenarios, I guess. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So one of the things I thought, I mean, there were so many themes that were present across all of your papers, but one that I was thinking about was the kind of role of geography, of location, within the kind of act of styling. And I'd love to know if all of you want to comment on how important kind of location or geography, I guess to an extent, kind of national identity, national heritage is, and the examples of styling that you discussed. And I wondered whether you think that kind of location is more important in the act of self-styling when you're young, because perhaps that's, you know, it's a formative time when you're working out who you are and how your style expresses that, but also you maybe have less other life experience to draw on, and maybe you've traveled less and you've lived in less places. So yeah, I just kind of wondered, you know, how much where you live and where you're from is shaping the kind of case studies. Rosie, maybe if you want to start us off with that one, with the London Review of Looks.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's enormously important. I think we're a lot more receptive to the world, and that we can articulate our response to the world through dress. And I acknowledge, I mean, what I was trying to say in one part of my paper is I don't think everyone does this. So that idea of not everyone tunes in the same way that I don't attune to sport, perhaps might be someone else's lack of attunement to noticing what people wear. But if you are attuned to clothing and dress, and it does help you articulate a sense of comfort or find your space in the world, then I actually think it happens at every age, to be honest. I imagine it would. Because I think, you know, a sense of figuring ourselves out is a lifelong process, but certainly maybe it's more visible for young people, particularly in that shift, Mariela, your work attends us to, of the shift of sort of teenage years and high school to potentially life after education and stuff. But, you know, as far as it goes for geography, I also think that's enormously important, because I do think the culture in which we live really shapes not only what we're allowed to wear in some contexts, but also what feels right for a climate. And I know when I moved here from Sydney, a lot of the clothes that I brought with me that I adore, I never wear, because not only are they much too light for this climate, but also they fit in Sydney and not really here. And I think that's something that's come up in conversations with others, I'm sure for all of us, you know, when you go on holiday, you pack what you think you want to wear and you get there and you're like, this is all wrong. And that can feel really uncomfortable if that sense of dress is important to you. So yeah, I think geography really has a big role to play, but I'd love to hear what Joe and Mariela think on this too.
Joe, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think what was quite interesting about, I mean, the participants we work with are from Manchester, which is a sort of, like London is a big sort of urban city. And I'm quite sure that if we did the same project somewhere geographically different, we might get very different results. But I think one of the sort of findings with it being a kind of big modern urban city was that a lot of our participants actually had transnational experience. They hadn't always lived in Manchester or even the UK all their lives. And quite a lot came through in their narratives around how they may have changed the way they dressed, you know, with that move. Or even if they're sort of going away to meet relatives, or, you know, traveling, and how they might adjust the way they dress, but also within the city, you know. And I think they talked a lot about how they might dress in one way in certain parts of the city or certain situations, and then adapt their dress elsewhere as well. So that was really interesting.
So I think my paper is very like geographical in that sense, because what the subjects like really wanted was to dress as someone else that they saw, that they weren't geographically in the same space, but they really wanted to be like them, like Per Jam, or they really wanted to be like The Cure or whatever. So I guess the geographical boundaries just expand for them, in the sense that they were trying to be like them, but with the resources that they had. So for them, the geographical space was limited in getting their clothes, but wasn't limited for their inspiration. So yeah, I think that's how geographical like boundaries shape their style. And of course music, because it's like they're obviously very tight. So if the subject was someone who called himself a rocker, he will want to wear something inspired from rock, grunge, ska, whatever. Or the other person who identify as reggae, hip hop, soul system, they really want to be on other like geographical spaces. So like I guess that's other like aspect that I saw. I'm sorry, just 1 second. I'm sorry about that. So the other aspect that I saw is that depending on your taste and your musical taste, that's how you express your geographical influences as well. So you can see like circum-Caribbean influences, and you can see also New York influences, and then you can see like London and United States and Argentina and Mexico, but at a point they all collide as well. So I guess that was pretty interesting for me.
Thank you. I thought it was fascinating that you mentioned that Costa Rica has a really important like coastline as a shipping port, and that kind of connection with the Caribbean was influencing the garments that were made available. I thought that was, yeah, a really interesting kind of insight into all of the other factors that are shaping these kind of style subtrends. Thank you.
So Mariela, I've got a quite specific question that I was quite interested by. So you showed the shops that were called Ropa Americana, which are like secondhand stores, and I wondered if there was anything within it around this is just a more sort of question around Costa Rican culture. Was part of the issues around buying from those stores about sort of something around sort of not necessarily a fear of secondhand, but being like, oh, buying secondhand is like it's, you know, you're seen as less wealthy, and perhaps that's how parents were perhaps viewing it, rather than being like American clothes incoming being bad. Was that a thing in Costa Rica?
I don't know if it was a thing. I wasn't pretty conscious of it. I was alive, but not conscious at the moment. But from what I gather and what they told me is that, and what I know as well a little bit about like Americanas, is that there's a myth surrounding secondhand clothing. And because we live in like a developing country, we know that we might get not the best secondhand clothing. So people do like this like train of thought on them is like pretty hard. So they linked the Americanas, or parents linked the Americanas with really lower status. So it's like if you want to have like an image on the world, you shouldn't be buying there because you might be poor, or like, you know, these all stigmas that are so wrong. And for them, aside from the rebellion and basically the rebellion aspect and the fact that they didn't have any money, it was more the link with American culture. Because I remember one girl told me like, you know, Americanas were the only place that I could find some Adidas sweater that I saw on TV, and it was cheap and I could afford it myself, and my parents can't buy it because Adidas is expensive. So it was more like a game, like a ping pong game between what they can have and also not like putting themselves into the myth that they were poor. Because the other thing about like this group that I interview is that they all belong to different social classes, and some of them are like pretty high status and some of them are pretty lower status, and all of them, no matter what, buy their clothes in Americanas because they also like saw the cheap clothing as an outlet for their creativity. So it doesn't matter if I cut this shirt because it cost me like $1 kind of thing. So I guess it's more like what you think about the Americanas, but I guess the parents were like, oh my God, this is evil, don't buy here, because they also want like to present themselves as something like higher than buying there. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
but...
it does, absolutely. Yeah.
Rosie, I have a question for you. I was really interested in the references you made to kind of the slightly longer history of fashion writing, and specifically mood-oriented fashion writing. And it was really lovely to hear such fresh examples from the pandemic, which is obviously a time that has been unusual in most of our lifetimes. You know, it's this really different kind of moment in history. And I wondered if you have noticed any kind of like cycles in fashion writing that captures mood in this way. You know, does it kind of come to the fore when times are more difficult? Does it kind of tie in with key moments in history? Is that kind of something that you've looked at and kind of drawn parallels between different periods?
That's such a great question, Lucy. I think to answer it, I probably have to do more research, to be honest, because for this project, I was really focusing on contemporary fashion writing, because I was thinking about how there are forms of fashion writing that I couldn't quite categorize, and in trying to articulate to myself what is it that's really dragging me in here, and I keep returning to certain authors' work again and again, and I think it's this sense of almost the articulation of that which we experience with clothing that's rarely spoken, and I guess I wanted to think about the ways that writing helps us access those things by articulating thoughts and feelings and trying to put it into language. And the way I came to the interwar period was primarily through Virginia Woolf's writing, her concept of frock consciousness, which is so famous, writing in her diaries about how engaging with clothing is a way of kind of feeling out the contours of the self. And I was actually, when I first started developing the idea, I thought, well, there's a lot of writers who wrote for mainstream fashion media, like Aldous Huxley or Joe Didion or Virginia Woolf. I wonder if there's something there around getting famous writers. But actually, when I looked into it, most of those people were writing about culture, and Woolf, for example, was writing about literature, and her writing for British Vogue. So I think it's definitely something that would be interesting to interrogate. But one thing I thought about, I guess, with the interwar period and now is the kinds of seismic shifts have been wrought in both contexts. And I don't think those shifts are necessarily comparable, but certainly the sense that seems to come through in fashion media in the sort of the interwar period around drastic change, like Cecil Beaton writes about how the beauty ideal just changes completely, and an older generation, he writes quite caustically, don't understand why soft plump hands aren't attractive to young people anymore, and because they're out of step with what's really going on. Or Diana Vreeland's exhortations in Why Don't You column, which is what I wrote about, kind of inviting people to imagine this highly aesthetic sensory world that was completely fanciful and totally steeped in class and totally steeped in whiteness, but that was trying to kind of access the ways that clothing can make you feel so uninhibited, I think. And so I think there was something happening there around escapism and change that maybe reflects some of the existential challenges and information overload that we're experiencing now, not just from the pandemic, but I think also the changes that the digital era have brought into our lives in terms of how people's working lives have changed and the increasing exploitation, etc. So there's a sense perhaps of fashion as a form of escapism, or trying to reach for the comforts of clothing or material culture that might be a buffet. That's just a very loose hypothesis, but be interested to look more into it, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. I should apologise for making this be historical when this is a contemporary session. It's a natural instinct. But I did think when you were talking about some examples that I encountered when I was doing my own research into the First World War period, and I spent a lot of time with a certain group of fashion writers who mostly wrote anonymously, and it was commercial. They were writing, it was fashion marketing, but at the end of the war, they talked a lot about the mood of fashion at the end of the war and how this particular garment was expressing the hope of liberation and the sense of joy on the streets, and whether that is true is a whole other question, but they really lent towards the mood of the time and trying to capture what was happening in changing style. So I think there's some really interesting parallels there.
Absolutely. I may have to hit you up for some of those references later.
Yeah, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think I'm like, as someone who largely writes about 1946, it's the same feeling as well. And everyone's like, or in my case, it's always like, just chuck a bit of everything in and see what happens. Anyway, sorry. So we've got another question here for Mariela, which is really interesting. And this is about some of the styles that you mentioned and the fact that they originated in much colder climates. So grunge is very much like a Seattle kind of look. And did you find with what you were looking at that there was kind of any adaptation of garments so that they were more suitable to the climate in Costa Rica?
I guess yes, because we don't have winter like you guys do, well, in northern countries. So they did basically, sorry, my past one, they did adapt it a little bit, but not much. I mean, instead of pants and like heavy sweater, they always use just like flannels and denim or shorts like cut in Martens, but it was more like using summer clothing, like what you can recognize as summer clothing all year long. So that was the adaptation of what I saw from the pictures that I gathered.
Fantastic, thank you. Lucy, you still struggling?
No, I'm in. Sorry, technology is just not on our side. It wouldn't let me open the Q&A. So I think this is a question here for Mariela. And it's somebody asking about how you found the people to interview. How did you identify your participants? And I also wondered whether you have any other, because I thought, you know, you were kind of talking about the kind of groups of people, but I was wondering if anyone really stands out to you from the research that you've done that you didn't get a chance to talk about. Was there anyone who had, you know, really specific garments that they wanted to share, or a particular look that they remembered?
So first of all, I'm gonna answer the how I got the people. I guess I'm also a fan of punk, so and rock, so I kind of knew who I wanted to interview. Then I talked to some colleagues who were like doing similar research as I was doing, so they guided me through their interview process as well. And how I gathered these people is just like, it was basically luck because all of them are pretty accessible, but the methodology that I use is I talk to people it was a snowball method. So I talked to people who knew these people and they recommend me with these persons. So it was more like a blind trust kind of thing. And then I reached out to some of them that I really wanted to talk through Facebook and Instagram. So that's these ones that I really wanted to talk I can say that are like the highlighted people that you are asking about. But then when I interview all of them, I'm gonna say that for me, all of them were super like complex and interesting, and I can like highlight any of them more than the other. There were some that talk more, so I have more examples of them rather than the others who talk less. But I mean, for me, all of them were super interesting because all of them belong to different music genres or identify as belonging to different music genres. So it was basically like a wide spectrum of post-subcultural groups. But yeah, I can say that I like or enjoy more an interview than the other one because they were all like super rich.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've got amazing source material to continue working with then.
Yeah.
Well, we still have actually got loads of questions left, but as we're hitting kind of the end of our time, we're really having to wrap up now. But I think there was some really, really interesting sort of connections that we were finding from this. And there was lots of thoughts about sort of rebellion, self-expression. And I think we'd like just some really exciting sort of research threads coming through all of it. So this is actually our last of the season. And we are so grateful to all of the people who have joined us this season, and we will be back in just a couple of weeks' time for our third season, which launches on the 20th of May with speakers Cecilia Gunsberger, Sabine Weber and Alison Topless. So we hope to see you all again next season. Thank you and goodbye.
So much, everybody.
Bye.
See you soon.